At the twilight of an era, as old certainties faded, the world held its breath. It was 1837. In the heart of a feverish Great Britain, an unknown was about to take human form. The death of King William IV was not just the end of a reign. It was the indication of a profound transformation, a new dawn that would redraw the map of power, industry, and life itself. And at the center of it all, a young woman almost unknown, Princess Victoria. At just 18 years old, she inherited not only a crown but an empire on the brink of disorder and greatness. This is the threshold of the Victorian era, a journey into the currents of power, social fissures, and the repercussions of a past that forged an extraordinary time. Great Britain was boiling. The Industrial Revolution roared, transforming the landscape with smoking chimneys and an unstoppable exodus to overcrowded cities. It was an era of remarkable progress, but tinged by severe exploitation, precarious living conditions, and a growing chasm between the opulence of a few and the desperation of the masses. The nobility clung to their privileges. The new bourgeoisie amassed fortunes, while millions struggled to survive. In this whirlwind, what could a teenage queen barely out of her sheltered environment do? Victoria. Her name would resonate through the decades. But in 1837, she was an uncertain figure, raised under the oppressive watch of her mother and the ambitious Sir John Conroy. Her childhood was a reclusion controlled by intrigues. Upon ascending the throne, her first act resonated with unexpected force, breaking the ties of Conroy's control, a blow of authority, a flash of the iron will that would define her reign. But was it an act of true independence or merely the prelude to new power struggles in an unyielding court? Was she truly ready for the overwhelming weight of an empire, or would she be consumed by the very forces that marked her youth? The coronation on the 28th of June in 1838 was a spectacle of great pomp. In Westminster Abbey, gold and jewels sparkled under the lights, a sharp contrast to the harsh reality of the streets. Outside, crowds cheered, placing their hopes in the young royal figure. But beneath the ceremony and celebration pulsed a palpable uncertainty. Would Victoria be the saviour they longed for, or merely a fragile symbol in turbulent times? Decisions did not take long to arrive. Her marriage in 1840 to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was more than a romantic union. It was a strategic alliance. Together they formed a singular couple, challenging conventions, with Albert taking on an active and modernizing role. They sought to stabilize the crown, projecting an image of family and virtue. But the presence of a German consort ignited old resentments. Could Victoria, united with a foreigner, truly be the unifying figure that Great Britain needed in a continent on the brink of new upheavals? The initial impact was felt immediately. Queen Victoria emerged as a moral reference, an emblem of respectability in an era of dizzying changes. Her image multiplied while the British Empire, insatiable, began to extend its tentacles across the globe. But this expansion brought with it the seeds of conflict. The tense Irish question, uprisings in distant colonies, the growing murmur of social discontent at home, challenges piled up on the horizon. Would the young queen have the strength to navigate these turbulent waters and keep together an increasingly vast and complex empire? Thus, the rise of Victoria opens an era and, with it, a persistent dilemma. How could this young woman, catapulted to the throne under such complex circumstances, become the indelible icon of an age defined by its own deep contradictions? The answers are not simple. They are woven into the decisions, sacrifices, and storms that marked her extraordinary reign. As the influence of her coronation fades, the world prepares to witness the unstoppable rise of the British Empire. A colossal expansion that would leave its indelible mark not only on Great Britain but in every corner of the planet it touched with its influence. Now, with Victoria on the throne, we delve into the heart of that unbridled ambition. The expansion of the empire. We will explore how a global dominion was forged that would challenge the world and whose consequences we still feel today. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That era of transformation and promises of progress that had begun with the ascension to the throne of Queen Victoria would be marked by an inescapable phenomenon, the expansion of the British Empire. In the decades that followed 1837, the empire would become a vast collection of territories spanning entire continents, from India to the Caribbean, and from Africa to the Pacific. This growth would not only change the face of the world, but also reconfigure political and economic power in Great Britain, establishing a legacy that would resonate through the centuries. The Victorian era unfolded in an environment of ambition and global rivalries. The Industrial Revolution, which was beginning to reach its peak, had transformed the British economy, giving rise to an emerging industrial class that demanded access to markets and raw materials. In this atmosphere, the desire for territorial expansion became a strategic imperative. The quest for new resources to fuel the relentless industrial growth and the need for new markets for British manufactured goods intertwined in a cycle of mutual dependence. But was the economy really the only driving force behind this expansion? Or perhaps there was also a component of ideology and a notion of destiny that propelled the British towards conquest. The key actors in this historical process are countless, and their decisions often intertwine in unexpected ways. Among them stands Lord Palmerston, who, as Prime Minister on several occasions, advocated for an active foreign policy. Firmly believing in Britain's position, his approach focused on protecting British interests abroad, not only through diplomacy, but also through military force. The British East India Company, whose influence expanded as the empire grew, played an equally crucial role. Under the leadership of figures such as the Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, the company not only consolidated its control over territories in India, but also established a model for colonial administration that would be replicated in other parts of the world. Against the backdrop of these leaders and their decisions, events began to unfold in a remarkable sequence. Starting from the decade of 1850, the British Empire would embark on a series of conflicts and conquests that would contribute to its expansion. The Boer War in South Africa, the intervention in Egypt, and the conquest of territories in Africa and Asia were just some of the milestones that would mark this era. The inauguration of the Suez Canal in 1869, for example, not only shortened trade routes but also symbolized Britain's access to India, considered the jewel in the crown of the empire. As the century progressed, the colonized lands became sources of wealth but also points of international tension. The immediate consequences of this expansion were profound and varied. Economically, the empire became a privileged source of resources that fed British industry. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean colonies, and gold from Africa became pillars of the British economy. However, this economic growth was not without difficulties. Local populations often found themselves subjected to conditions of exploitation and dispossession. Ethnic and cultural tensions increased, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. What complexities still awaited in the depths of these interactions between colonizers and the colonized? The question surrounding the expansion of the British Empire is, perhaps, its legacy. While some celebrate the advancements in infrastructure and education that were introduced in the colonies, others point to the human and cultural costs that this expansion entailed. The dilemma between progress and exploitation becomes an ethical quandary that still resonates in the present. Can imperial expansion be justified under the pretext of civilizing and modernizing? This question does not find simple answers and raises a reflection on the repercussions that persist in the British legacy. With the backdrop of imperial expansion and its implications, the events that would shape the Industrial Revolution come into view. The transformation of Great Britain into an industrial power would not only redefine its economy but also modify its social and cultural fabric. The arrival of new technologies and the emergence of an urban society carved a new path where progress and suffering coexisted in a delicate balance. The question that arises now is, how would this revolution impact the daily lives of people? And what structural changes were looming in Victorian society? That expansion of the empire would soon be accompanied by an equally monumental transformation at the heart of Great Britain. In the uncertain atmosphere of the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution began to spread its wings, unleashing a torrent of changes that would transform the very structure of Victorian society. The agrarian economy that had prevailed for centuries was on the brink of collapse, while the sound of steam engines echoed in every corner of the nation. How did this technological revolution become such a powerful engine of change and, at the same time, a mystery for those who lived through it? In this context, the Industrial Revolution was not simply an economic phenomenon. It was a social and cultural metamorphosis that irrevocably altered the lives of millions. In 1760, the first signs of this transformation began to be heard, but it was in the decade of 1830, coinciding with the rise of Queen Victoria, when the revolution reached its peak. This period was marked by the emergence of factories, the rise of the railway, and the development of new technologies that promised not only prosperity but also an uncertain and, at times, difficult future. The protagonists of this story were not anonymous figures. Among them stood out names such as Richard Arkwright, who perfected the mechanical loom, and George Stephenson, considered the father of the modern railway. Their decisions and visions were fundamental in shaping the industrial reality. Arkwright, with his invention of the spinning machine, not only propelled the textile industry but also laid the foundations for a factory work system that relied on massive labour, often composed of women and children working under very harsh conditions. What sacrifices were hidden behind the pursuit of efficiency and economic growth? Meanwhile, in the realm of transportation, the development of the railway became a symbol of progress. The Grand Line of Liverpool and Manchester, inaugurated in 1830, not only connected cities but also transformed the way people and goods moved. However, this advancement brought with it unprecedented disorder. Cities filled with workers seeking employment, and old rural traditions began to crumble. Was this the price they had to pay in the name of progress? As factories proliferated, living conditions in cities began to deteriorate. Overcrowding, pollution and poverty became elements affecting the growing working class. London, with its dense population, transformed into a labyrinth of deprivation and struggle, where hope coexisted with despair. Social tension sharpened, and the question that hung in the air was, could Victorian society find a balance between technological advancement and human well-being? The immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution were profound and varied. Economically, Great Britain emerged as the industrial power of the world, but at an immense social cost. Child labour, labour exploitation, and growing social inequality began to provoke outrage among some sectors of society, giving rise to reformist movements demanding change. This struggle for labour rights would be a persistent constant throughout the Victorian era. However, despite the evident changes, a doubt remained in the air. How could the remarkable wealth of industrialists coexist with the extreme poverty of workers? As inventions and innovations advanced, the unsettling question remained unanswered. Was there a solution to the tensions that the Industrial Revolution had unleashed in British society? Thus, the Industrial Revolution stands as a crucial chapter in the narrative of the Victorian era, a period that not only redefined the economic landscape but also left a trail of uncertainty and unresolved questions. As Great Britain ventured into a new world of possibilities, the influence of industrial transformation continued to loom, raising questions about the future of its society. In this journey through the Industrial Revolution, each decision and each technological advancement intertwine in a complex panorama of progress and conflict. The next stage of this story will take us to explore the social structure that emerged amid this industrial upheaval, where life in cities and the countryside would confront the realities of an evolving society, and where class dynamics would become a central theme in Victorian discourse. What realities awaited in the crowded streets of London? And how would they influence the future of the nation? After the influence of the Industrial Revolution, a deeper and more subtle transformation was brewing in the heart of British society. Queen Victoria, a symbol of an expanding empire, sat on the throne in a context of accelerated changes that affected not only the economy but also the very structure of society. The Victorian era would be distinguished not only by its growth but also by the divisions and tensions that would sear its legacy. In this chapter, we will delve into the complexity of Victorian society, a web of classes that defined the behaviour, aspirations and fears of millions. As the 19th century progressed, Great Britain found itself at a crossroads. The rise of industrialization had created a new middle class, emerging from the chimneys and factories that dominated the landscape. But what did it really mean to be part of this new class, in contrast to the old aristocratic elites that had ruled for centuries? The social structure was like a complex system where hierarchies were marked not only by wealth but also by lineage and status. At the heart of this dynamic was the nobility, a group that, although it began to lose some of its influence in the face of the rise of the middle class, still retained considerable power. Families such as the Duke of Wellington and the Earl of Derby, for example, were key figures in British politics. Their decisions, influenced by a sense of feudal responsibility, often clashed with the interests of a bourgeoisie that clamoured for greater recognition and representation. This tension between the old and new elites would become a recurring theme during Victoria's reign. The rise of the middle class, composed of industrialists, merchants and professionals, brought with it a new set of values. The work ethic, aspiration and an orderly life became fundamental virtues. This class sought stability and respect and often saw itself as the true engine of British progress. But where did this leave the most disadvantaged, those trapped in poverty and exploitation in the factories? Workers, for the most part, were a distant presence in the narrative of Victorian prosperity. The Industrial Revolution, while generating wealth, also created a chasm between those who benefited and those who suffered under very difficult conditions. Factories were environments of despair where men, women and children worked long hours for minimal wages. The struggle for labour rights was brewing as an underground current in the streets, but would it be enough to challenge the established order? Social movements began to take shape, and figures such as Robert Owen and his ideas of cooperativism began to resonate among those yearning for change. However, the established powers, largely represented by the aristocracy and landowners, resisted these winds of change. Politics became a battleground between the old order and new ideals, a struggle that was fought not only in institutions but also in the very heart of society. The decisions of political leaders of the time also played a crucial role in shaping this society. The Reform Act of 1832, driven by figures such as Prime Minister Earl Grey, began to open the doors to greater representation, but it was still insufficient to address the concerns of the lower classes. The big question that remains is, was this a first step towards true democratization, or simply an attempt to calm tensions before real discontent erupted? As the decade of the 1850s progressed, social dynamics became more complex. The working class began to organize, and the first labor associations emerged in response to injustices. However, repression was quick to follow. The government's response to workers' demands was, in many cases, repression and indifference. The police became a presence that monitored those who dared to challenge the status quo. The situation grew increasingly tense, and the question persisted: what would happen when the patience of the oppressed ran out? The particularity of Victorian society ultimately lies in how an era of advancement and growth could coexist with profound inequality and suffering. The tensions between classes, the struggles for power and rights, and the persistence of oppression resonated in every corner of the nation. The question that this chapter leaves us with is, could Queen Victoria's legacy be remembered as a time of progress? Or would it be the prelude to an inevitable change in the British social structure? As the influence of the Industrial Revolution continued to cast its shadow over society, scientific advancements and emerging knowledge would begin to play a crucial role in shaping Victorian life. The next stage of our exploration will take us to discover how these advancements transformed the perception of the world and challenged established beliefs, revealing an even deeper aspect at the heart of the Victorian era. The atmosphere of change and ambition that characterized the Victorian era was not only manifested in the social and political fabric of Great Britain, but also in a realm that stood as a pillar of progress: science. In a world where the Industrial Revolution had transformed production and daily life, the fervor for knowledge and the exploration of the universe became the new frontier, the quest for answers. Bold experiments and revolutionary theories resonated in an environment where human curiosity was at its peak. Thus, science emerged not only as a field of study, but as a cultural phenomenon that promised to unveil the mysteries of the world and the human condition. At the beginning of the Victorian era, the historical landscape was marked by a country in full transformation. The Industrial Revolution had altered the social structure, creating an environment where research and development were favoured by the wealth flowing from factories and trade. Education began to be seen as a fundamental pillar for progress, and prominent figures started to emerge, willing to challenge established knowledge and explore the frontiers of science. In this vibrant atmosphere, academic institutions and scientific clubs multiplied, creating a network of exchange that fed the thirst for discovery. But what aspects still awaited in the depths of this new world? Among the key figures of this chapter is Charles Darwin, whose work on the origin of species, published in 1859, would change the way life on Earth was understood. His theory of evolution by natural selection not only questioned the prevailing religious notions about creation, but also unleashed a whirlwind of debates that would resonate for decades. Darwin, a naturalist whose curiosity led him to explore the Galapagos Islands and beyond, became the embodiment of a new era of thought that challenged old beliefs. How could humanity accept that it shared a common ancestor with other species? This questioning became the core of a dilemma that endures to this day. Alongside Darwin, other names emerged on the scientific scene. Michael Faraday, a pioneer in the study of electromagnetism, conducted experiments that laid the foundations of modern electrical engineering. His discovery of electromagnetic induction in 1831 not only transformed the way electricity was generated and used, but also opened the door to a new era of technology that would change daily life. Faraday, through his tireless work and dedication, became a symbol of human capacity to unravel the workings of the universe. But what was the extent of knowledge? How far were scientists willing to go in their pursuit? The events in the scientific realm were not limited to individual theories and discoveries. In 1851, the Great Exhibition was held at the Crystal Palace in London, a monumental event that brought together the best of science, technology, and industry. This showcase of human ingenuity not only celebrated the achievements of Victorian engineering, such as the steam locomotive and textile machinery, but also symbolized the union of science and progress. Through this exhibition, the public could glimpse the future that awaited them, a future where science and technology promised to improve the lives of all. However, beneath that shining facade lay concerns about the social impact of these advancements and their ethical implications. Was it truly an advancement for humanity or a sign of what was to come? The immediate consequences of this scientific fervor were profound. Medicine, driven by discoveries such as anesthesia and antisepsis, began to transform medical practice. Figures like Joseph Lister, by introducing the use of antiseptics, revolutionized surgery, drastically reducing mortality rates and allowing interventions that had previously been considered extremely dangerous. This change not only saved lives, but also altered the perception of science as a cold and distant field, revealing its capacity to directly impact people's lives. However, with each advancement came the unsettling question: where would this accelerated path of discoveries lead us? As science ventured into unknown territories, debates arose about its limits and morality. Physics, biology, and medicine became battlegrounds of ideas, where religion and science clashed in a conflict that would define the era. Theology found itself in crisis in the face of the revelations of evolution, while advances in understanding the human body challenged traditional beliefs about life and death. In this context, the question became increasingly urgent: what truths and complexities lay hidden behind the pursuit of knowledge? The dilemma that looms over this chapter of Victorian history is ultimately a question of balance. How far is humanity willing to go in its quest to discover the truth? The Victorian era, with its fervour for knowledge, leaves us with a haunting reflection on the cost of progress. The pursuit of science and knowledge, as remarkable as it is unsettling, invites us to wonder if the light that illuminates our path may also cast its own consequences. As we delve into the complexities of Victorian society, it is imperative to consider how these scientific tensions intertwine with other aspects of life during the era. The Irish question, with its profound political and social dilemmas, emerges as a theme that not only reflects the struggles of a nation but also the inherent tensions of an expanding empire. How do science and politics intertwine at a moment when knowledge seemed to be the key to the future? History awaits us, ready to reveal its facets and complexities. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. This situation of tension would soon unmask a problem that had been latent in the very core of the British Empire: the Irish question. On the threshold of the Victorian era, Ireland found itself at a crossroads, caught between oppression and the struggle for identity. On one hand, the island was seen as an agricultural treasure by the British elites, while on the other, its inhabitants suffered the consequences of a policy that seemed to ignore their most basic needs. Hunger, poverty, and socio-political discrimination intertwined in a difficult landscape that would become the backdrop of a conflict that would resonate through the centuries. In 1837, the year Victoria ascended to the throne, tensions in Ireland were about to explode. The Great Famine, which would unleash itself in the decade of 1840, would be merely the catalyst of a discontent that had been brewing for decades. The Irish economy was deeply affected by an almost total dependence on the potato, a crop that, although vital, was incapable of sustaining a population that was growing at an alarming rate. The land leasing system, dominated by British landlords, exacerbated the precariousness of Irish peasants who were often forced to face exorbitant rents and deplorable living conditions. The main actors in this complex scenario were diverse. From the Governor-General of Ireland, Lord Clarendon, to political figures like Daniel O'Connell, a nationalist leader who advocated for Catholic emancipation and the improvement of living conditions for his people. O'Connell, known as the Liberator, had garnered significant popular support, but his peaceful approach clashed with the growing impatience of the masses. But was O'Connell's leadership truly sufficient to confront the difficulties that threatened to engulf Ireland? The answer, tragically, would reveal itself over time. The unfolding of events that would lead to the Great Famine was an insidious process, characterized by a series of decisions that, although made with the intention of stabilizing the situation, only served to aggravate it. In 1845, when the late blight disease ravaged the potato crops, the British government, led by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, attempted to implement relief measures. However, these were insufficient and in many cases poorly executed. British rhetoric focused on the need to maintain order, but at the cost of a people who found themselves on the brink of despair. As the harvest failed and the famine intensified, the British response became increasingly authoritarian. Troops were deployed in an attempt to control the riots, while anti-nationalist sentiment grew among the British elites. In this context, the lack of empathy and the dehumanization of the Irish became evident in the policies implemented, which often prioritized the British economy over the lives of the Irish. What complexities still awaited in the depths of this conflict? History shows us that amid adversity, the voices of resistance began to rise. The immediate consequences of the Great Famine were devastating. The Irish population decreased drastically, with approximately 1 million people dying and another million emigrating to the United States and other destinations in search of a better life. This exodus not only left a deep mark on the social fabric of Ireland, but also transformed British politics in unexpected ways. Protests and resistance movements began to take shape, fueling a nationalism that would challenge the existing power structures. The effects of the famine would resonate in the years to come, giving rise to a series of political movements seeking Irish autonomy. The Irish question became a recurring theme in British politics, a problem that never seemed to be fully resolved. Promises of reforms and autonomy were frequently unfulfilled, leaving the Irish in a constant state of uncertainty and distrust towards the British government. What paths would the Irish follow in their quest for justice? History had more surprises in store for both sides of the Irish Sea. Thus concludes our journey through the Irish question, a chapter marked by tragedy, suffering, and the struggle for identity. As the repercussions of the past rise, history invites us to reflect on the lessons still unlearned. How would Great Britain face the consequences of its decisions in the future? The next stage of our journey will take us to explore the reforms and political changes that would emerge in the heart of a nation seeking its own voice, a reflection of the struggle that would resonate through the decades. This situation of instability would soon give way to a period of intense political reforms that would transform the landscape of Victorian Great Britain as the influence of protests and discontent resonated in the streets. The clamour for change grew increasingly intense. At the heart of this whirlwind was the Reform Act of 1832, a key piece of legislation that promised to modify the very structure of the British Parliament and, with it, the fate of a nation. To understand the magnitude of these reforms, it is crucial to situate oneself in the historical context that preceded them. British society in the early 19th century was marked by deep social and political divisions. An outdated electoral system allowed only a small fraction of the population, mostly upper-class men, to exercise their right to vote. The industrial cities, which flourished thanks to the Industrial Revolution, experienced rapid population growth, but their inhabitants lacked representation in a parliament dominated by landowners and aristocrats. This mismatch between political power and social reality created an environment conducive to discontent. The French Revolution of 1789 had left a trail of fear among the British elites, who saw in the demands for reform the possibility of a similar uprising. However, the pressure for change intensified, and the voices of reformers such as the philosopher Jeremy Bentham and the reformist politician Charles Grey began to gain ground, reflecting the need for broader representation. The key figures in this story of reforms were not only political figures, but also agents of change who, with their decisions, paved the way for a new era. Charles Grey, the first Earl Grey, emerged as the principal architect of the Reform Act of 1832. His vision was driven by a desire to modernize the political system and respond to the demands of emerging sectors, such as the industrial middle class. Alongside him, other influential figures such as Lord John Russell and the political activist Henry Hunt played crucial roles in mobilizing the public and defending democratic principles. Together, these men faced the resistance of conservatives who feared that any change could destabilize the social and political order they had known. The unfolding of events that culminated in the approval of the Reform Act was a tumultuous and often tense process. Mass meetings and demonstrations multiplied in the major cities, highlighted by the famous gathering in Birmingham Square in 1831. Where thousands of people demanded change. In this climate of agitation, the riots in Bristol and Nottingham in 1831 led to direct confrontation between law enforcement and reformists, revealing the polarization and desperation of a people yearning to be heard. Despite the Conservatives' attempts to quell the uprising, popular pressure became irresistible. The Reform Act was finally approved in 1832. But its impact was much more than the simple expansion of suffrage. Indeed, the law extended the right to vote to householders in the cities, increasing the number of voters from around 500,000 to approximately 800,000. However, this expansion was still insufficient to include all working-class men and, in fact, completely excluded women. The new law also redefined electoral constituencies, eliminating many of the rotten boroughs where votes were irrelevant and redistributing representation toward the new industrial areas. But was this a genuine shift toward democracy, or merely an attempt to placate growing discontent rather than address the roots of the problem? The immediate consequences of these reforms were palpable. The Reform Act of 1832 initiated a series of political changes that would eventually lead to further reforms in the following decades, including the expansion of suffrage in 1867 and 1884. However, the change was neither uniform nor immediate. Discontent remained latent, as many continued to be excluded from the democratic process. The aftermath of social injustice persisted, and the clamour of unmet demands echoed in the heart of industrial cities. The question that lingers in this chapter is whether the Reform Act of 1832 truly represented a step toward a more inclusive democracy, or whether it was instead a mere appeasement of a people hungry for justice. What complexities still awaited in the depths of a political system that was just beginning to open up to modernity? As we delve into the next phase of Victorian history, it is vital to consider how these reforms would impact urban life and the challenges that would arise in a rapidly transforming world. Life in the cities, with its dizzying growth and social upheavals, would be the stage where the tensions and conflicts that would define the future of the nation would unfold. This agitation would soon manifest in the bustling streets of Victorian cities, where urban life was transforming at a dizzying pace, exceeding the expectations of its inhabitants, as factories rapidly emerged in the landscape. The sound of the hammer and the spark of steel mingled with the clamour of a constantly moving population. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution had brought with it the promise of prosperity, but also a set of challenges that loomed in the advance of modernity. By the middle of the 19th century, Great Britain had become the cradle of unprecedented urbanisation. In 1801, London had approximately 1 million inhabitants. By 1901, that figure had multiplied by 4. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham stood as industrial titans, attracting thousands of men, women and children from rural areas in search of work and a better life. However, this rapid transformation was not without complications. What realities lay hidden behind the facade of progress? Life in Victorian cities was a complex matter. The urban population, which was growing exponentially, faced a series of challenges that included poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of basic services. The working class found itself trapped in an endless cycle of exploitation, working long hours in often very harsh conditions. The factories, illuminated by the dim light of grey days, offered employment, but also a difficult environment where effort and despair intertwined. Key figures such as the entrepreneur and cotton magnate Samuel Gregg played a crucial role in this transformation. Gregg, a pioneer in the textile industry, not only boosted the local economy but also became a symbol of the duality of the era, economic progress at the expense of social well-being. In his factories, the pursuit of efficiency and profitability translated into a strict regulation that left little room for human compassion. Children were often the most vulnerable, trapped in a system that regarded them as mere gears in the productive machine. Amidst this situation, social movements emerged that challenged the status quo. Concern for living and working conditions was expressed in the formation of trade unions and in the struggle for labour rights. In 1834, the Society of Friends of the Working Class was one of the first organisations that sought to improve the living conditions of workers. But were these initiatives sufficient to counteract the power of industrial and political elites? The development of cities also brought with it a series of architectural and urban innovations. The construction of sewage systems and the introduction of gas lighting were notable achievements that, however, did not fully resolve public health issues. Outbreaks of cholera and other infectious diseases were constant reminders of the dangers of urban life. In 1854, the cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London revealed the fragility of the city's infrastructure and the lack of understanding about the spread of diseases. This event, catalyzed by the work of physician John Snow, demonstrated that contaminated water was the source of the problem and led to the creation of a more effective sanitation system. But how many lives were lost on the way to this revelation? The immediate consequences of this unchecked urbanization were palpable in the daily lives of citizens. Families crowded into precarious housing where the lack of space and resources generated tensions and conflicts. The once peaceful streets became stages for protests and disturbances, where desperation and indignation manifested in shouts and collective actions. The famous uprising of cotton weavers in Manchester in 1842 is a clear example of how social tensions could erupt in an instant. However, despite the challenges, life in Victorian cities was also marked by a spirit of resilience and creativity. Culture flourished amid adversity. Theatres, museums, and art galleries began to proliferate. Although they were often reserved for the more affluent classes, the works of authors like Charles Dickens captured the essence of urban life, revealing the hidden faces of a transforming society. But what aspects still awaited in the depths of everyday life? This chapter of Victorian history leaves us with a persistent dilemma. How can industrial progress be reconciled with human well-being? The decisions made by leaders and entrepreneurs of the time laid the groundwork for a radical change in society, but at a cost that many still suffer as a consequence. As a reflection of the times, Victorian urban life presents itself as a showcase of the struggle between advancement and humanity, a dilemma that continues to resonate in our contemporary cities. As we delve into the next chapter, we will focus on the art and culture that emerged in this context of transformation. How did artists and thinkers respond to the challenges of their time, and what legacy did they leave in the tumultuous landscape of the Victorian era? The answers to these questions will lead us to discover the vibrant world of creativity that arose amid the agitation. That industrial transformation that had begun to weave the daily life of the British would soon find its reflection in an unprecedented cultural flourishing. The Victorian era, marked by a palpable irony, presented a stage where art and culture would become the expression of a society in constant change. Under the patronage of Queen Victoria, the world of art transformed into a field of exploration of the human soul, a refuge where the consequences of modernity confronted the influences of a glorious past. As the 19th century progressed, Great Britain found itself at the pinnacle of its global influence, but it also faced internal tensions. The Industrial Revolution had granted the nation unparalleled economic power, but at the cost of the lives of millions of workers caught between the harshness of factories and impoverished neighborhoods. In this context, art not only became a means of expression, but also a tool for social critique and reflection. The royals, and particularly Queen Victoria, played an essential role in promoting the arts. Since her ascension to the throne in 1837, Victoria and her husband Prince Albert became advocates for a cultural resurgence. With their interest in the fine arts, music and literature, the royal couple propelled a series of exhibitions, including the Great Exhibition of 1851, an event that celebrated industry and art in the same space, the iconic Crystal Palace. This glass and iron monument not only symbolized technological innovation, but also stood as a temple dedicated to human creativity. What realities did that palace, which housed the wonders of the world, represent? Among the artists who shone in this era were figures such as the painter John Everett Millais, a founding member of the Pre-Raphaelites, whose focus on the vivid representation of nature contrasted with the academic idealism of his time. Millet's work, Ophelia, is a testament to this quest for authenticity, where beauty and tragedy intertwine on the same canvas, challenging the viewer to contemplate the fragility of life. At the same time, literature experienced a renaissance with authors such as Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters, whose works addressed social injustices and the moral dilemmas that arose in Victorian society. What lessons could be drawn from the stories that seemed to resonate with the experiences of daily life, but also reflected a profound disillusionment? Amidst this cultural effervescence, art exhibitions, music and literature created a dialogue between the elites and the working classes. The creation of institutions such as the Royal Academy of Arts and the Victoria and Albert Museum fostered access to culture, seeking to democratize art at a time when social inequality was palpable. Queen Victoria, in her role as a patron of the arts, not only granted artists the visibility they needed, but also provided them with a status that allowed them to explore themes that often remained in the shadows of society. The impact of this cultural boom was immediate and profound. Works of art began to reflect not only daily life, but also the aspirations, fears, and longings of a society at a crossroads. The tensions between tradition and modernity manifested in artistic movements, such as the Neo-Gothic, which sought to recover the splendor of past eras while the world turned towards an uncertain future. The revolts in art, such as the aesthetic movement that proclaimed that art for art's sake should prevail, challenged established norms and generated an environment of constant discussion about the purpose of art in human life. But was art truly a safe refuge, or rather a form of escape from the harsher realities of Victorian life? However, the cultural legacy of the Victorian era did not stop at the borders of Great Britain. British influence spread throughout its empire, where artistic expressions began to merge with local traditions, creating an amalgam of styles that reflected the diversity of the world under British rule. This melting pot of cultures, however, also raised unsettling questions about exploitation and imperialism. To what extent could culture be genuine in a context that was often marked by oppression and control? As art and culture flourished, the consequences of inequality and social injustice remained present. The lives of workers, conditions in factories, and women's struggles for their rights became recurring themes. In this environment, art became a mirror that reflected not only beauty but also the struggles and suffering of those who often found themselves stripped of their voice. The artistic currents that emerged in this context, such as realism, began to challenge the idealization of daily life, presenting a more raw and honest vision of existence. The consequences of this cultural boom were not limited to the artistic sphere. They also influenced social and political thought. As literary and artistic works began to give voice to injustices, movements emerged that sought social change. The growing awareness of the human condition, promoted by the artists and writers of the time, laid the groundwork for future social and political reforms. Could it be that art, in its capacity to connect people with their deepest emotions, could also catalyze real change in society? The question that this era of artistic splendor leaves us with is profound. Despite cultural achievements, the presence of exploitation and inequality remained latent, raising the question, could art truly change the world? Or was it simply a reflection of the limitations of the society that produced it? The search for answers to these questions became a journey both personal and collective, where the voices of a generation resonated through the pages of history. Thus, the chapter on art and culture closes, leaving behind a trail of concerns and reflections on the role of art in Victorian life. The exploration of the human condition and the struggle for social justice had begun. But the path toward equality was still fraught with challenges. In the next chapter, we will delve into the question of women, where we will discover how women began to claim their place in this transforming society, challenging established norms and outlining the first traces of a movement that would change the course of history. This environment of change would soon reveal itself as a battleground for a much deeper and personal conflict, the struggle of women for their rights in Victorian society. In a world where the effects of oppression seemed unbreakable, women began to raise their voices, challenging an established order that relegated them to invisibility. This chapter delves into the complexity of the woman question in the Victorian era, a period marked both by growth and by a silent struggle that would resonate through generations. The historical context of the mid-19th century in Great Britain was steeped in contradictions. While the British Empire expanded rapidly, engulfing territories and resources at home, the role of women was rigidly defined. Victorian society, with its emphasis on morality and domesticity, relegated women to a secondary role, limited to household tasks and child-rearing. However, this era also witnessed the emergence of new ideas and movements that began to question these roles. The early manifestations of feminism were sprouting, driven by a burning desire for equality and recognition. Among the figures who emerged in this tumultuous landscape stands the activist and writer Emmeline Pankhurst, who, although her greatest impact would occur in the following century, represents the spirit of the time. Pankhurst was part of a generation of women who began to challenge the limitations imposed by patriarchy, seeking access to education, the right to vote, and the possibility of participating in public life. Alongside her, other women such as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first woman to obtain a medical degree in Great Britain, and Florence Nightingale, a pioneer in modern nursing, began to break through the wall of exclusion. The decisions made by these women, as well as by their contemporaries, were bold and often risky. In an environment where higher education was a privilege reserved for men, women began to organize. In 1850, the first Association of University Women was founded, a movement that sought the inclusion of women in higher education. These actions not only challenged social norms, but also sowed the seeds of a change that would resonate in the collective consciousness of the nation. As the decade of the 1860s progressed, the development of civil rights movements, such as the movement for the abolition of slavery, offered a model to follow. Women became involved in campaigns that, although not directly related to their rights, taught them about organization, mobilization, and the importance of voicing their demands. The Declaration of Seneca Falls in 1848 in the United States had ignited a spark that would cross the Atlantic, influencing British women who sought their own rights. However, despite these advancements, the path to equality was fraught with obstacles. The resistance from the more conservative sectors of society, which viewed women's emancipation as a threat to the family and social structure, was fierce. The idea that a woman should have a voice in politics or work was seen as an incomprehensible notion to many. What would happen if women began to claim their place in the world? This dilemma became a debate that would echo in discussion halls and in the hearts of activists. The immediate impact of these struggles was palpable. The first Married Women's Property Act, passed in 1882, allowed women to retain their property and earnings, a crucial step towards economic autonomy. However, the question that lingered in the air was, would this be the beginning of a more radical change, or merely a patch that did not address the core of the problem? Victorian women became a symbol of resistance, but the true challenge that lay ahead was the nature of their struggle. It was the sign of a social change that was approaching, one that promised to challenge the foundations of a society that had defined the role of women for centuries. History was in motion, and the winds of change began to blow strongly. With every step they took, the women of the Victorian era were not only fighting for their rights, but also weaving a legacy that would endure long beyond their own lives. The unknown that remained was whether this legacy would translate into a lasting transformation of society, or if it would simply be a footnote in history, forgotten by time. As the struggle for women's rights began to take shape, another aspect of Victorian society started to transform the collective consciousness: education. Would education be the key to women's emancipation? Or would it become another tool of control in the hands of a society that feared change? The next chapter will reveal the complexities of this evolving educational system and its impact on the fight for equality. This situation of unrest would soon manifest in every corner of the nation, and amid this social turmoil, education emerged as a field of silent debate. As political and economic tensions shook British soil, the need for a more accessible and efficient educational system became increasingly urgent. Thus, the Victorian era became a period of crucial transformation in the realm of education, where the influence of change resonated in every classroom and in every corner of society. By the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, education in Great Britain was a privilege reserved for the most part for the upper classes. The elites were the only ones who could afford to send their children to private schools, while working-class families lacked the resources to provide formal education. Sunday schools, although offering a glimpse of instruction to children from the lower class, were insufficient to address the growing needs of an industrialized nation. With the arrival of Queen Victoria to the throne in 1837, the social and political context became ripe for the implementation of educational reforms that would change the landscape of knowledge in Great Britain. Among the key figures in this movement was Lord Ashley, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, a fervent advocate for children's rights and education. His tireless work in legislation regarding the working conditions of miners and his push for public education resulted in the Education Act of 1870, which marked a milestone in British educational history. This law allowed for the creation of public schools that offered free education to all children, gradually dismantling the barriers that had kept the majority of the population in ignorance. The development of these events was a complex and multifaceted process. In 1861, the report of the Education Commission, known as the Report of the Commission of 1861, revealed alarming levels of illiteracy in the country and advocated for universal basic education. But the reforms did not stop there. A growing movement towards technical and vocational education began to take shape, driven by the Industrial Revolution, which demanded a more skilled workforce. Technical training schools emerged, providing workers with the necessary skills to thrive in a constantly changing labour market. However, it was not all a straightforward path to enlightenment. There was considerable resistance to these changes, especially among those who feared that broader education would lead to social unrest. The elites feared that access to education could empower the working classes and threaten the established social order. And amid this dilemma, the question arises: was education a tool of emancipation or a mechanism of social control? The immediate consequences of these reforms were profound. As more children began to attend school, literacy rates increased significantly. The growing middle class began to value education as a means of social ascent, while women started to gain access to education in unprecedented volumes. Institutions such as University College London became pioneers by admitting students of both sexes, challenging the gender norms of the time. However, despite these advances, education remained a field of debate where ideological struggles were waged over what type of knowledge should be imparted and to whom. The dilemma of education in the Victorian era lies in its duality, a system that promised equal opportunities, yet at the same time reflected the persistent inequalities of society. Did education truly manage to be a means of liberation, or did it simply perpetuate old systems of power? The questions linger in the air like presences in classrooms that still hold the memories of their former pupils. As Queen Victoria entered deeper into her reign, the prospect of the Crimean War began to loom over Great Britain, a conflict that would test not only the military strength of the empire, but also its ability to face the internal challenges arising in a constantly transforming world. This instability would soon transform into a conflict that would mark a turning point in international relations during the Victorian era. The Crimean War, a complex scenario of interests and ambitions, would erupt in 1853, engulfing Great Britain in a conflict that would reveal not only the fragility of alliances, but also the difficulties lurking at the heart of the empire. The political and social context that preceded the war was a mosaic of tensions. Europe, in the decade of 1850, was a stage of calculations and rivalries. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and far from its former glory, was on the brink of collapse, while the European powers, led by Russia, Great Britain and France, were preparing to seize any opportunity that arose. The situation in the Balkans, along with Russian pressure on the straits that provided access to the Mediterranean, became a crucial point of friction. Would Russian expansion to the south be a sign of unchecked ambition or a legitimate attempt to protect its strategic interests? At the epicenter of this storm was Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, who, with his informed vision, sought to advise her on the best way to address the threats. However, the Queen, deeply influenced by her desire to maintain European balance, found herself caught between loyalty to her Ottoman allies and the growing pressure to act against Russian expansionism. The decisions she would make during this crucial period would not only affect the fate of thousands of soldiers, but also outline the future direction of British foreign policy. The outbreak of conflict in 1853 was abrupt, triggered by the dispute over the rights of Christians in the Holy Land and access to sacred sites, igniting nationalist and religious fervour across Europe. Russia, under the leadership of Tsar Nicholas I, sent troops to the Danube, thereby challenging the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. Great Britain, fearing that Russian control in the region would destabilise the balance of power, decided to intervene. The decision to send troops under the command of General Lord Raglan was made in a context of growing alarm and urgency. But was the intervention truly a safeguard of civilization or merely a strategic move to preserve British status quo? The war unfolded in a setting that seemed straight out of a campaign chronicle. British troops, alongside their French allies, arrived on the Crimean Peninsula in 1854, facing Russian forces in the besieged port of Sevastopol. The battles fought from Balaclava to Alma became tales of bravery and tragedy. The famous charge of the Light Brigade, an act of valour that ended in disaster, became a symbol of the confusion and disorder that reigned on the battlefield. The inefficiency of logistics and the lack of preparation of the British Army led to a high human cost. The effects of these events resonated in the heart of the nation, sparking debates about the quality of leadership and the need for reforms in the military. The immediate repercussions of the war were profound. The victory, although achieved, exposed the weaknesses of the British military system and highlighted the need to modernise the armed forces. The figure of Florence Nightingale emerged in this context, becoming a symbol of modern nursing and emphasising the importance of medical care on the front lines. The war left a legacy of reforms that would transform the military structure and public perception of medical service. But amid this transformation, a troubling question remains. Had victory truly been achieved, or would the scars of war leave a legacy of suffering and distrust that would endure? In the end, the Crimean War was not only a military conflict, but a complex web of political decisions, ideologies, and the influence of an empire seeking to reaffirm its power in a changing world. The lessons learned and the consequences that lingered after the conflict left a question mark in British foreign policy. How would leaders confront the new challenges that would arise in a world where the balance of power was increasingly fragile? As Queen Victoria watched from her palace, her empire stood at a crossroads. The decisions made in the salons of London would have repercussions that extended far beyond the shores of Crimea. The next stage of this Victorian story will take us to explore how the railway would transform not only the economy, but also the connections between nations, marking the beginning of a new era of progress and unforeseen challenges. This situation would soon be accompanied by a phenomenon that would transform the structure of the country, the arrival of the railway. As the 19th century progressed, Great Britain was immersed in a wave of changes, where steam and steel stood as symbols of a new era. The Industrial Revolution had provided the necessary impetus, but it was the railway that would elevate the nation to new heights, challenging the limitations of geography and redefining the social and economic interactions of its time. The historical context surrounding the expansion of the railway was one of contrasts. In a nation where tensions between social classes were palpable, the effects of industrialization had begun to fragment the social fabric. Cities grew at a dizzying pace, fueled by the migration of peasants seeking job opportunities in factories. However, this growth did not come without its difficulties. Poverty and deplorable working conditions intertwined with the ambition of an elite seeking economic growth at any cost. In this context, the railway emerged as a solution, a means to connect not only places but also people, amidst a landscape marked by inequality. The main actors of this railway revolution were both visionaries and pragmatists. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of the most celebrated engineers of the time, became a symbol of British ingenuity. His masterpiece, the Great Western Railway, was not only a technical achievement but also represented a commitment to the idea of progress. Alongside him, figures such as George Stephenson, known as the father of the railway, laid the foundations of a railway network that would soon extend across the country. The decisions of these men, along with the investments of companies such as the London and North Western Railway, charted the course of British transportation and economy. The development of the railways was a journey not without obstacles. The construction of tracks crossed agricultural lands and villages, and not everyone was willing to cede their territory in the name of progress. There were protests, conflicts, and a resistance that rose against the arrival of the train. Considered by some as a threat that would bring industrialization to their doorstep. However, the momentum was unstoppable. In 1830, the first public railway between Liverpool and Manchester began operations. And with it, a new era of human mobility was born. Trains not only transported goods but also ideas, cultures and identities as Victorian society faced its own contradictions. The immediate consequences of this railway revolution were profound. The British economy was propelled by unprecedented growth, markets expanded and trade was facilitated to levels that had previously seemed unimaginable. The distances that once separated communities were shortened, and smaller towns experienced a boom as they became strategic points in the railway network. However, difficulties also arose. Industrialization brought with it an increase in pollution and the deterioration of living conditions in cities. Was this the price of progress? Did economic improvement justify human suffering? The dilemma of the chapter looms over an undeniable fact. The railway was, without a doubt, a driver of change and progress. But at what cost? Had it truly managed to unite the country, or had it created new divisions? As trains traversed British lands carrying their passengers toward an uncertain future, questions about this progress still echoed in the echoes of time. Against the backdrop of this railway revolution, Great Britain was delving into new and complex issues, and the next chapter will reveal one of the most controversial aspects of the Victorian era, the opium trade and the wars it triggered with China. What complexities still awaited in the depths of this dark trade? History was far from over, and each rail of the railway seemed to resonate with the promises and dangers that lay ahead. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. This expansion would soon reveal the hidden facets of a trade that would transform the fate of nations. In the context of the Victorian era, where the expansion of the British Empire reached new dimensions, a troubling issue emerged in the darkest corners of the economy: the opium trade. This chapter delves into the complex relationship between Great Britain and China, a story marked by ambition, greed, and the wars that would inevitably erupt as a consequence. As the 19th century progressed, the British Empire found itself at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution had propelled Great Britain into a new economic paradigm. But it had also exposed an urgent need: access to markets that would ensure the flow of goods and resources. In this context, opium, a substance traditionally used in medicine, would become the key to unlocking a trade that would alter the global balance. The growing demand for Chinese tea, a highly valued product in the metropolis, drove British merchants to seek ways to balance their trade deficit with the Middle Empire. The East India Company, a powerful entity that dominated British trade in Asia, became the protagonist of this story. Under the leadership of figures such as Lord William Bentinck, the company began to cultivate opium in India, exporting it to China in large quantities. Despite the strict Chinese laws prohibiting opium consumption, the demand was insatiable and the temptation of profits undeniable. Thus, what began as a commercial exchange transformed into a moral and political conflict that would resonate around the world. The company's decision to use opium as a means to balance trade was, in many respects, a calculated act. Emperor Daoguang, aware of the social and economic deterioration that opium was causing in his country, declared war on its importation. In 1839, the first of the Opium Wars erupted when the Chinese government, driven by the desire to protect its population from addiction, confiscated and destroyed large shipments of opium in Canton. This action, far from calming the situation, provoked the ire of Great Britain, which would see the defense of its commercial interests as a just cause. The armed conflict that followed revealed not only British military superiority, but also the deep cultural and political divisions that existed between East and West. British forces, equipped with advanced technology and modern military tactics, quickly overcame Chinese resistance. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking would bring an end to the war, imposing humiliating conditions on China. The cession of Hong Kong to Great Britain and the opening of several ports to British trade, including the legalization of opium. This treaty not only signified a military victory, but also left a legacy of distrust and resentment that would endure for generations. The immediate consequences of the war were devastating for China. Opium addiction skyrocketed, and with it the deterioration of public health and social stability. The Chinese elites, unable to cope with the crisis, found themselves at a crossroads. Should they accept the opium trade and its economic benefits, or resist an empire that seemed unstoppable in its ambition? The moral and political dilemma became a reflection of the internal struggles of a country torn between modernization and tradition. However, the true issue surrounding the question of opium does not lie solely in the wars and their consequences, but in the unanswered questions that remain. What price did China really pay for its resistance? Was the war a necessity imposed by trade, or was it the result of unchecked greed that clouded the judgment of British leaders? And above all, what lessons can be drawn from this dark chapter of history? The story of opium in the Victorian era is not just a chronicle of wars and treaties, but a reminder of how commercial interests can blur the lines between morality and greed. In its pursuit of control and expansion, the British Empire left a legacy that would resonate through time, a repercussion of decisions that still echo in international relations today. As the influence of the opium question looms over the events of the time, another dilemma hovers on the horizon: the struggle for suffrage. This next chapter will take us to explore the process toward the expansion of the right to vote, a journey that, like the opium trade, is filled with complexities and tensions that will shape the future of Victorian society. What changes will come? History, always ready to reveal its facets, awaits us. This social tension would soon give way to an even deeper and transformative issue: the right to vote. In the second half of the 19th century, the influence of voices calling for equality began to resonate strongly in the streets and parliaments of Britain. The expansion of suffrage became a dilemma, a labyrinth of political interests, social struggles, and moral convictions that would forever change the face of the nation. In the historical context of the Victorian era, social and economic tensions intertwined with a political system that favoured the elites. While the Industrial Revolution brought with it a new working class, a vast number of citizens lacked the right to participate in the election of their representatives. The Parliament, dominated by men of high social standing, ignored the needs of those who had contributed to the economic growth of the country. In this environment, the struggle for suffrage became a symbol of emancipation. Not only for men of the lower classes, but also for women who, although still voiceless, were beginning to make their presence felt strongly. Among the key figures of this era was John Bright, a politician and activist who, along with other members of the radical movement, advocated for the idea that suffrage should be a universal right. Bright firmly believed that working men, regardless of their economic position, should have a voice in Parliament. His influence was crucial in strengthening the reformist movement, which sought to expand access to the vote. At the same time, figures like Emmeline Pankhurst emerged as leaders in the fight for women's rights, joining forces in a front that challenged the foundations of Victorian patriarchy. The first major breakthrough towards the expansion of suffrage came with the Reform Act of 1867, which, despite its name, did not offer a complete solution. This act extended the right to vote to a significant number of working-class men, nearly doubling the number of voters in England and Wales. However, the exclusion of women and many men from the lowest classes left a gap in the promise of equality. This legislative act, although celebrated, raised questions about the true nature of British democracy. Was a superficial change sufficient to address the deeper injustices of society? The decade of the 1870s witnessed growing pressure from organised movements. Demonstrations and public meetings became a vehicle for the expression of silenced voices. The movement for women's suffrage, led by brave women like Millicent Fawcett and her colleagues from the National Society for Women's Suffrage, began to take shape. These women not only demanded the vote, but also challenged the social norms that kept them relegated to the domestic sphere. The question that hung in the air was unsettling. Could women truly break the chains of a society that viewed their aspirations as mere whims? As pressure mounted, the government's responses varied. Opposition to universal suffrage was based on arguments that seemed solid at the time. Many feared that a broader electorate would lead to disorder and irresponsible decisions. However, the emergence of a new political discourse began to challenge these notions. The idea that all citizens, regardless of their gender or class, had the right to be heard began to gain traction in the minds of some political leaders. Among them was Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, who, although reluctant to support women's suffrage, could not ignore the clamour of the times. Events accelerated towards the Reform Act of 1884, which further expanded male suffrage, bringing it to 60% of the adult population. However, the struggle for women's suffrage remained active, and women's frustration intensified. Why, despite the reforms, did their voices remain silenced? The issue deepened, and women began to adopt bolder methods. Direct action, even civil disobedience, began to be part of their strategy. Suffragists organised marches, protests, and acts of civil disobedience, challenging not only legal norms but also the social standards that defined their existence. The year 1910 marked a turning point. Amid growing political tension, political parties began to see suffrage as an issue they could no longer ignore. Women, through their tireless struggle, had managed to make their demands part of the national debate. However, compromises and empty promises continued to be the common denominator. The question persisted: how much more would they have to sacrifice to obtain the right that seemed so unattainable? The immediate consequences of this struggle were profound. British society found itself at a crossroads. Political reforms not only altered the electoral landscape but also challenged established notions of gender and class. The pressure for women's suffrage began to resonate in other countries, serving as a beacon of hope for similar movements around the world. But the path to complete universal suffrage, where men and women could vote on equal terms, was still fraught with obstacles and resistance. The issues surrounding the expansion of suffrage in the Victorian era are not limited to the achievements made, but also to the unresolved questions that remain. Was the effort of those who fought for equality truly sufficient? Or were the social and political changes merely an illusion, a repercussion of a deep desire that has yet to be fully realised? As the chapter on the expansion of suffrage closed, the presence of a new challenge began to emerge on the horizon. The colonial question, with all its complexities and contradictions, would soon become the next major theme of this journey through the Victorian era. With each step, the legacy of this era intertwined with the struggles for justice and equality, leaving a trail of questions that still await answers. This issue would soon manifest in the colonies, where the repercussions of British colonial policies began to resonate with alarming intensity. The second half of the 19th century was characterized by an imperial peak that, far from being a mere exercise of power, intertwined with a complex web of political and social decisions that would shape the destiny of entire nations. The Colonial Question, a term that encompassed both the aspirations of the empire and the realities of the colonies, would become a dilemma that challenged the metropolis. The historical context in which these policies developed cannot be understood without considering the environment of growing competitiveness among European powers. The preceding decades had witnessed a surge in industrialization, which demanded new markets and resources. Thus, the British Empire, under the leadership of figures such as Benjamin Disraeli and Lord Palmerston, was driven not only by the desire for territorial expansion, but also by the need to ensure a constant flow of raw materials for its burgeoning industry. The colonies became key pieces on a geopolitical chessboard, where each move was intended to secure British hegemony. The key actors in this colonial crossroads were not solely British politicians. At the heart of imperial expansion were also trading companies, such as the East India Company, whose interests often determined the course of entire nations. The influence of these corporations was such that at times they were attributed with the capacity to initiate military conflicts, as evidenced in the First Opium War, which not only left an indelible mark on China, but also demonstrated how commercial interests could overshadow ethical and humanitarian considerations. The unfolding of events surrounding the colonial question is a narrative intertwined with stories of resistance, exploitation, and asymmetry of power. As the empire expanded, the colonies in Africa, India, and the Caribbean began to experience drastic changes. In India, British policy consolidated after the revolt of 1857, a rebellion that revealed the deep tensions between settlers and the native population. The subsequent repression, which included the dissolution of the East India Company and the establishment of British Raj, left a legacy of resentment that would last for generations. In Africa, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 marked the beginning of a frantic race for colonization, where European powers divided the continent as if it were a mere playground, ignoring the cultural and social complexities of its inhabitants. The immediate consequences of these decisions were devastating. The colonies became mere extensions of the metropolis, exploited for their natural resources and labor. Infrastructures were built not to benefit local populations, but to facilitate the transport of raw materials to Europe. In the case of Africa, this meant the fracturing of entire societies, the creation of artificial borders, and the emergence of ethnic conflicts that persist to this day. In India, the introduction of taxes and agricultural systems that favoured British settlers led to economic crises and famines that claimed millions of lives. But was it really so? Was the empire an insatiable machine of exploitation, or was there also a narrative of civilization and progress that the colonizers strove to present? This moral ambiguity becomes the true dilemma of the colonial question. While some argued that British presence brought advancements in education and health, others questioned whether these benefits justified the oppression and suffering inflicted on native populations. Thus, the influence of these colonial policies would reverberate not only in the colonies but also in the heart of the metropolis. The growing awareness of the injustices of imperialism would begin to sow the seeds of change in British public opinion. But the path to reform would be long and tortuous. The legacy of the colonial question would stand as a constant reminder that every action has its repercussions, and that the legacy of the empire was far from a tale of prosperity. As we delve into the next phase of the Victorian era, the culture of progress would rise as a beacon of optimism in the face of the difficulties of colonial exploitation. What complexities still awaited in the depths of this legacy? The answer to this question will lead us to explore the faith and optimism that characterized the era, even amidst its contradictions and conflicts. That unyielding faith in progress, latent in the heart of Victorian society, rose as a guide amidst the fog of change. The Industrial Revolution had left its indelible mark on the British landscape, transforming not only the economy but also the perception of the future. In this era of technological and scientific advancements, optimism became the fundamental pillar of everyday life, a vibrant influence that reverberated through the streets, factories, and tea rooms. The culture of progress not only promised a better future, but also redefined national identity. The historical context that preceded this explosion of optimism was marked by a series of social and economic transformations. In the decades prior, Great Britain had witnessed the arrival of new machines, innovations that changed the way of producing and living. From the mechanical loom to the locomotive, each invention was received as a victory over nature itself. A declaration of independence from the limitations of the past. The emerging middle class, enriched by trade and industry, began to demand a voice in political affairs, creating an environment conducive to change. Among the key figures of this era was Queen Victoria herself, whose figure stood as a symbol of a rising nation. Her reign, which spanned from 1837 to 1901, was not only a period of political stability, but also of fervent nationalism. Alongside her, politicians such as Benjamin Disraeli and William Ewart Gladstone became protagonists in a scenario where faith in progress was the common thread. Disraeli, with his imperialist vision, and Gladstone, with his insistence on social and political reform, made decisions that resonated in the lives of millions. Both, in their pursuit of a bright future, emphasized the role of Great Britain as a leader of the world, a beacon of civilization and progress. As the second half of the 19th century progressed, the culture of progress materialized in a torrent of events. The world exhibitions, such as the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace in London, became showcases of human ingenuity. There, visitors witnessed achievements in engineering, design, and technology. The faith in progress was reflected in the admiration for science, which promised to unravel the mysteries of the universe. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in On the Origin of Species in 1859, sparked debates about the very nature of life, challenging deeply rooted beliefs and opening doors to new ways of thinking. But did this optimism not conceal doubts and contradictions? The immediate consequences of this culture of progress were palpable in every corner of society. The growth of cities, driven by migration to industrial centres, brought with it an increase in the urban population and, with it, new challenges. The faith in modernity also fostered the development of infrastructures, such as railways and bridges, that connected previously unreachable territories. However, as factories proliferated, so did precarious working conditions. Hopes for a better life were often overshadowed by the reality of long working hours in unsanitary environments. Was progress truly a universal phenomenon, or merely the shine of a promising future that concealed the suffering of many? The dilemma surrounding Victorian culture of progress lies in the dichotomy between overflowing optimism and harsh realities. As the machine of progress advanced, how many voices were drowned in its roar? This question resonates through the pages of history, inviting deeper reflection on the true cost of advancement, with the influence of the Industrial Revolution still casting its shadow over society. Attention inevitably turned towards health and medicine. Advances in these fields, often driven by the same faith in progress, promised to transform the quality of life for millions. What aspects awaited in the next revelation of this era of transformation? That culture of progress, so characterized by innovation and advancements, also brought with it a problem that affected the health of millions. The Victorian era, marked by growth and at the same time by the difficulty of disease and suffering, found itself at a crossroads. As the Industrial Revolution transformed the British landscape, public health conditions emerged as a profound and perplexing issue that urgently needed to be unveiled. In this context, the 19th century stood as a witness to the struggle between development and deterioration. Cities grew at a dizzying pace, attracting peasants and workers in search of opportunities. But this massive influx created an environment conducive to diseases. Causes such as pollution, lack of sanitation, and the limited understanding of microbiology, which was still in its infancy, generated a grim outlook. The cholera epidemic of 1832, a devastating event, shook Victorian society and tested the response capacity of a medical system in crisis. The possibility of death loomed constantly, and the fear of the unknown gripped the population. In this chaotic scenario, key figures emerged who would attempt to unravel the problems of public health. One of them was the physician and social reformer Edwin Chadwick, whose groundbreaking work in investigating living conditions in cities led him to advocate for radical reforms in the sanitation system. Chadwick, driven by a fervent desire to improve health conditions, presented his famous report of 1842, which revealed the terrible realities of urban life and proposed a system of sewage and drinking water supply. However, his vision was met with skepticism and resistance, a reflection of the struggles between defenders of tradition and pioneers of change. As the decade of 1850 advanced, the battle for public health continued. In 1854, another milestone would mark the path toward understanding diseases, the cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London. The response of John Snow, a physician who ventured beyond the boundaries of traditional medicine, would reveal the connection between contaminated water and the spread of disease. Armed with a simple map, Snow identified the infection points and charted a path that challenged the beliefs of his time. His research not only saved lives but also laid the foundations of modern epidemiology. However, how many more had to succumb before his message was heard? In the wake of these confrontations, political reforms emerged that sought to restore dignity and health to the population. The Public Health Act of 1848, although timid, was a first step toward creating a more robust public health system. Despite its implementation, the results were uneven, and the struggle for an efficient and equitable system continued. The decisions of political and medical leaders were often marked by resistance to change and lack of resources, creating a labyrinth difficult to navigate. The immediate impact of these events was palpable. Public health began to position itself as a priority, although many difficulties still remained to be dispelled. Improvements in living conditions and access to medical care began to take shape, but the path was filled with obstacles. Diseases continued to lurk, and the population, although more aware, grappled between hope and despair. The dilemma of Victorian public health persisted. Who would be the true beneficiaries of medical advancements, and at what cost? As this chapter of history closes, a resonant question lingers in the air. Was the effort of these reformers truly sufficient to change the course of a society that had been mired in suffering? The search for answers leads us to the structures of Victorian architecture, where hospitals were built and urban planning was charted, in an attempt to shape a healthier future. In the next chapter, we will explore how these architectural decisions reflected the needs of a transforming society and how aesthetics intertwined with public welfare, revealing even more aspects of the vast legacy of the Victorian era. This complex situation would soon reveal a new face of Victorian society, one that would rise tangibly in the architecture beginning to flourish throughout the United Kingdom. In a period marked by economic growth and the expansion of the empire, the structures that emerged were not only a reflection of the aspirations of a burgeoning nation, but also of the social and political complexities that accompanied it. Victorian architecture, with its ornamental details and stylistic diversity, became a symbol of progress, but also a matter that invites us to explore the particularities of its creation. The historical context of the era is situated at a moment when Queen Victoria, after ascending to the throne in 1837, became the emblematic figure of an age of transformation. The Industrial Revolution had altered the British landscape, giving rise to an unprecedented urban phenomenon. Cities grew at a dizzying pace, and with them, the need for new buildings that not only housed the growing population, but also manifested national pride. In this context, Victorian architecture flourished, influenced by a mix of styles ranging from Gothic to Renaissance, merging in a quest for national identity. Among the key figures who propelled this architectural revolution was the architect Augustus Pugin. His vision of the Gothic revival became a pillar of Victorian aesthetics, seeking to return to the values of the Middle Ages as a means to rediscover the morality and spirituality of architecture. Pugin, with his fervent belief in the importance of morality in design, influenced the construction of landmarks such as the Palace of Westminster, redefining not only the skyline of London but also the way power was perceived at the heart of the empire. As the great cities expanded, Victorian architecture diversified in response to the needs of different social strata. Middle-class homes began to adopt elaborate forms and ornamental details, while public structures such as theatres and museums were designed to impress and educate the populace. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace, was not only a showcase of industrial ingenuity, but also a display of Victorian architecture at its peak, symbolising the connection between the grandeur of the empire and human ingenuity. However, beneath the shiny surface of this era of growth lay tensions that could not be ignored. Rapid industrialization brought with it public health issues, overcrowding and pollution. While the elites indulged in the opulence of their mansions, the living conditions of workers were often deplorable. This contrast was reflected in the architecture, where the luxurious villas of Kensington and Chelsea coexisted with the grim tenement blocks emerging in industrial areas. Was this disparity a reflection of progress or a consequence of it? Decisions about what and how to build became a symbolism of power and social class. Architectural masterpieces such as the British Museum Library were erected as a statement of access to knowledge, while working-class neighbourhoods remained in the shadows of ignorance. Architecture not only told the story of an era, it also revealed the keys to a socio-economic system in crisis, where the promised progress for many was merely a mirage for others. As the decades passed, Victorian architecture continued to evolve, but its legacy became a paradox. What did the splendour of these buildings truly mean in a society marked by inequalities? Was architecture a refuge for the powerful or a cry of hope for the forgotten? The answers seem as intricate as the details adorning the facades of these constructions. At the end of this journey, we find ourselves faced with an unresolved dilemma, a repercussion of the contradictions that define the era. Victorian architecture presents itself as a symbol of ambition and achievement, but also as a reflection of the underlying tensions that tore at society. As we delve into the next chapter, we will explore how these tensions manifested in British foreign policy and the strategic alliances that defined the course of the empire. Could it be possible that the very architecture that symbolized power also served as a backdrop for the conflicts that loomed ahead? This situation of tension would soon transform into a global battlefield, where the repercussions of imperial ambition would resonate beyond the British shores. The foreign policy of Great Britain during the Victorian era stood as a web of intrigues and strategic alliances, a complex scenario that would define international relations and the fate of entire nations. In this context of growing tension and competition, the empire was compelled to forge ties that, although often fragile, promised stability in an increasingly entangled world of conflicts. The political and social atmosphere that preceded these events was marked by the expansion of the British Empire, which spread across continents and oceans. As Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, European dynasties struggled to maintain their relevance in the face of the advance of industrialization and colonialism. This era also witnessed the consolidation of Great Britain's power, which, following victory in the Crimean War, sought to reaffirm its hegemonic position against other emerging powers such as Germany and the United States. Key decisions in this web were made by prominent figures who, with their visions and strategies, shaped the destiny of nations. Among them stood out Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who, with his political acumen, propelled the expansion of the empire and fostered crucial alliances. His rival, William Ewart Gladstone, also played a fundamental role, advocating for a more ethical foreign policy, although often his stances translated into a moral dilemma for the nation. This duality in British leadership reflected the inherent tensions of a foreign policy that oscillated between imperialism and morality. Over the years, Great Britain forged strategic alliances that defined its role on the world stage. The Triple Alliance with France and Russia, known as the Entente Cordiale, was established as an attempt to isolate Germany and contain its military growth. At the same time, the United Kingdom became involved in conflicts in Africa and Asia, seeking resources and markets, while relations with other powers grew increasingly complex. The Opium Wars with China and the expansion into India are examples of how British decisions not only altered the balance of power, but also left a legacy of resentment and resistance. The events of the era not only had immediate consequences for relations between nations, but also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The policy of divide and conquer used in the British colonies generated tensions that would endure beyond the 19th century. The way these ties were managed, often based on economic and strategic interests rather than genuine diplomacy, left unsettling questions about the nature of peace achieved through coercion. But was it really so? Against the backdrop of a constantly changing Europe, the alliances forged sought not only stability but also concealed a web of hidden rivalries and excessive aspirations. As the 19th century progressed, the complexity of British foreign policy became more intricate, leaving in its wake a series of questions that would resonate in the decades to come. For the colonized peoples, the question persists. What price was paid for imperial glory and territorial expansion? The decisions made in the offices of London had repercussions that extended beyond the oceans, affecting the very fabric of societies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The aftermath of the strategic alliances and the conflicts that arose from these decisions still resonate today, posing a historical dilemma that invites reflection. Thus, the chapter of Victorian foreign policy closes in a twilight of uncertainty, leaving the viewer with a sense of unease. As the world prepared to enter the 20th century, the accumulated tensions and legacies of imperial policy were poised to erupt. The crisis of faith looming in the next chapter will reveal how these conflicts not only affected nations but also challenged deeply rooted beliefs in Victorian society. What questions await on the horizon of faith and reason? This general tension would soon manifest palpably in the fabric of Victorian society. On the threshold of the 19th century, Great Britain found itself at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution had not only transformed the physical landscape with factories and railways, but had also unleashed a torrent of questioning regarding faith and morality. Traditional religion, which had been the pillar of everyday life, began to show fractures under the weight of new thoughts. Uncertainty was palpable, a consequence of an ancient order that wobbled on its pedestal. The political and social context of this period is crucial for understanding the crisis of faith. Amid unprecedented imperial expansion, where scientific and technological achievements seemed to offer answers to questions that had previously been left to divine interpretation, an introspective movement emerged. Society, increasingly influenced by rationalism and advances in science, began to question the absolute truths that had governed its existence. The Theory of Evolution by Charles Darwin, presented in his work On the Origin of Species in 1859, was a hallmark of this new era of thought. His theory challenged the biblical narrative of creation, leaving many in a state of perplexity. How could religious teachings be reconciled with the idea that man was the product of a natural process and not of divine design? Among the key figures that emerged in this context of transformation, we find Thomas Huxley, known as the Bulldog of Darwin for his passionate defense of evolutionary theory. Huxley not only championed scientific empiricism but also confronted religious opposition. His famous phrase, "Science cannot and must not accept the authority of tradition," resonated as a call for intellectual emancipation. Meanwhile, the Anglican clergy, represented by figures such as the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, struggled to maintain the integrity of faith in a world that seemed to drift away from it. This confrontation between traditional religious thought and emerging science not only polarized society but also left a lasting mark on British culture. The development of these events was a gradual yet relentless process. As Darwin's ideas gained popularity, debates in universities and intellectual circles became increasingly heated. Meetings of the religious liberals movement began to proliferate, where literal interpretations of scriptures were questioned. Churches, which had once been centers of social life, found themselves facing an existential dilemma. Should they adapt to new paradigms or cling to the traditional beliefs that had guided generations? The immediate consequences of this crisis were profound. Congregations began to fragment, sects and new denominations emerged, offering worldviews that often challenged traditional teachings. Unitarians and Quakers, for example, found fertile ground for their beliefs among an audience seeking answers that resonated with their new experiences. Religion, which had been a refuge, became a battleground of ideas. The figure of Queen Victoria, who had been seen as a symbol of stability, became embroiled in a whirlwind of spiritual dilemmas as her own concept of faith transformed into a crucible of uncertainty. But what complexities still awaited in the depths of this spiritual crisis? As society began to reconsider its relationship with the divine, a new question emerged. Could faith coexist with progress? The inquiries piled up and the search for meaning intensified in a world that seemed to have lost its way. The answers would not be simple, and the legacy of this era of questioning would leave visible scars on the history of religion in Great Britain. In this environment, the doubts of skepticism began to loom over everyday life. Evangelization missions, once the pride of the empire, started to be viewed with suspicion. The idea that Christianity was the only universal truth faced the challenge of cultures and religions that revealed a plurality of beliefs. In this context, figures like the philosopher John Stuart Mill, with his defense of liberalism and individual autonomy, began to influence the thought of the time, suggesting that truth might not be an absolute but a concept in constant evolution. The crisis of faith not only represented an internal struggle between religion and science, but also reflected a broader cultural shift. Literature, philosophy, and art began to explore these new paradigms, with writers like Thomas Hardy and George Eliot questioning traditional values and proposing new myths and narratives. The Victorian landscape became filled with ambivalence. The chandeliers of churches cast their light over a world that was no longer sure of the direction it should take. Thus, as the Victorian era entered its maturity, the repercussions of these questions resonated in every corner of society. Faith, once unbreakable, had become a battleground of ideas, but the legacy of this crisis would not stop at the border of the spiritual. How would this questioning affect rural and urban life in the next chapter of this rich and complex history? The answers, like many of the truths of the time, would remain an enigma as the layers of life in the countryside were unveiled, where traditions faced the challenges of a changing world. The era of progress and innovation, which had transformed cities into vibrant centres of activity, was not the only face of Victorian Great Britain. Beyond the factories and railways, the countryside whispered stories of a different life. Anchored in ancestral traditions and profound changes, life in the countryside, a reality of contrasts and transitions, unfolded against a backdrop of agricultural transformations that would shape the nation's course. By the middle of the 19th century, Great Britain found itself at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution had generated a massive exodus of rural populations to cities where the promise of employment in factories dazzled many. However, the consequences of this migration resonated in the vast fields and villages where communities struggled to maintain their identity in a rapidly changing world. The countryside, often seen as a refuge of peace and simplicity, was also a place where economic hardships and new agricultural practices began to reshape daily life. In this context, the figure of the farmer became crucial. The traditional agricultural system, which had remained relatively unchanged for centuries, began to undergo a radical transformation through the introduction of new techniques and tools. Crop rotation, the use of chemical fertilizers, and the improvement of ploughing techniques were just some of the innovations that started to take root in agricultural practice. These changes were largely driven by the growing demand for food that accompanied population growth and urbanization. But who were the visionaries behind these transformations? Among the most prominent names was the agronomist Thomas Coke, known as the Earl of Leicester. Through his work in the Norfolk model of agriculture, Coke promoted crop rotation, which, by including legumes such as clover, not only improved soil quality but also increased food production. His legacy was not limited to enhancing productivity. He also urged farmers to adopt a more entrepreneurial mindset, a paradigm shift that blurred the lines between rural work and market economy. Meanwhile, the figure of the landowners remained fundamental. Many of them, driven by the need to make their lands profitable, began to invest in new technologies. The introduction of agricultural machinery, such as the McCormick reaper, allowed farmers to drastically increase their yields. However, this modernization did not come without its difficulties. Rural communities, which had relied on seasonal work and local labor, began to experience unease. Was this the price of progress? The development of enclosures also played a crucial role in transforming the rural landscape. The Enclosure Acts, a set of laws that allowed landowners to claim common lands, altered the way rural communities interacted with the land. While some hailed efficiency and modernization, others saw in this measure a loss of rights and a fracture in social cohesion. Villages that had shared resources for generations found themselves divided, and many peasants displaced were forced to leave their homes in search of new opportunities in the cities. The immediate impact of these changes was profound. Villages began to empty, and with them, a sense of community and belonging faded. However, amid this desolation, rural life did not extinguish. In contrast to urban growth, agricultural traditions and festivities continued to be celebrated, albeit with an increasingly tenuous presence. The arrival of industrialization brought with it a new way of life, but it also left in its wake unsettling questions. What would happen to those left behind? How would rural life adapt to these times of change? The paradox of Victorian rural life lies in the coexistence of its resilience and its transformation. As the countryside modernized, customs intertwined with new methods, creating a unique blend of the old and the new. But could this duality survive in a world that seemed to advance relentlessly toward industrialization? This chapter in Victorian history is not just about agricultural changes and innovation. It is a testament to the struggle for identity in a time of uncertainty. In the sound of ploughs and the whisper of the wind among the fields, a question resonates for the future. Will the legacy of this agricultural era, marked by change and resilience, endure in the collective memory of the nation? Against the backdrop of a constantly transforming rural life, the story of Great Britain was about to take an even more significant turn. As the prospect of the death of Queen Victoria loomed over the country, the repercussions of changes in the countryside were preparing for an inevitable conclusion. The next stage, marked by reflection and loss, would unfold in a context of irreversible changes and unanswered questions. The Victorian era, marked by growth and opulence, found itself at a turning point. The spectre of death loomed over the United Kingdom as its citizens faced the imminent loss of their revered sovereign. The final years of Queen Victoria intertwined with a period of profound and turbulent changes in the country, where the figure of the monarch symbolized both imperial power and the social tensions that began to surface. As the Queen advanced into her golden years, the repercussions of personal suffering resonated within the walls of Buckingham Palace. Following the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, Victoria fell into a mourning that distanced her from public life. For nearly 2 decades, her figure faded, and the country wondered, where was the Queen who had been the beating heart of an expanding nation? The political atmosphere was tense. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the British landscape, but it had also brought social discontent. The voices of reformers cried out for change while the empire showed signs of wear. However, in the twilight of her life, Victoria would face challenges more personal than political. By the late 1900s, Queen Victoria had become a symbol of an era that, although remarkable, was beginning to crumble. The last years of her life were marked by loneliness and illness. In 1897, the country celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, commemorating 6 decades on the throne. The festivities were grand, but the Queen appeared distant, increasingly trapped in her world of memories and pain. The question that reverberated in the air was, could someone as imposing as she be vulnerable to the passage of time? Victoria's health began to deteriorate. Medical reports revealed a series of ailments that compromised her vitality. Despite the care of the best doctors of the time, her body weakened. In 1900, after a series of illness episodes, the Queen retreated to her residence at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, seeking solace in the memories of her beloved Albert. It was there that her mind, still bright and full of sharpness, would immerse itself in a silent struggle between life and death. In this context, several figures played a fundamental role in Victoria's final days. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, Edward, assumed a more prominent role in state affairs, while the Queen, on her deathbed, clung to her legacy. Her relationship with her family was complex, her fervent love for her children often intertwined with disapproval and frustration over their life choices. What aspects of her family relationships did Victoria keep hidden? How much of her suffering was shared and how much was a solitary burden? On the 22nd of January in 1901, the air in Osborne House grew heavy. In the darkness of her room, Victoria took her last breath. The news of her passing spread like wildfire across the nation and beyond, signalling the end of an era. The Queen's death marked the closing of a chapter. At the moment her heart ceased to beat, the British Empire faced an uncertain future, marked by the transition into the 20th century. The immediate consequences of Victoria's death were profound. The country entered a period of mourning, and her son, Edward VII, ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of a new era. The criticisms and praises of her reign intertwined in a complex mosaic of opinions. Citizens wondered, what legacy would Queen Victoria leave behind? Her figure, so revered, was also a subject of controversy. The reforms she had championed and her influence on British politics would be analysed and debated in the years to come. The question that lingered in the air was this: could a figure as iconic as Queen Victoria be truly understood in her entirety? What facets and complexities of her personal life lay hidden behind her public image? Her death not only marked the end of her reign, but also left unanswered questions about the future of the empire and the role of the monarchy in a changing world. As the nation plunged into mourning, the first signs of change began to emerge. The Victorian era had come to an end, but its legacy would endure in the dawn of the 20th century. As the new king, Edward VII, took the reins, the country prepared to face a series of challenges that would test the very heart of the empire. The question on everyone's mind was, how would the monarchy adapt to the new times that lay ahead? The transition to the next chapter of British history was unfolding, and the influence of Queen Victoria would still resonate in the days to come. The influence that emerged after the death of Queen Victoria in 1901 was not only that of her august figure, but also that of an era that had shaped and transformed the world. The impact of the Victorian age extended far beyond the boundaries of the 19th century, leaving a legacy that would resonate in the 20th century and beyond. Thus, we find ourselves facing the complexity of the Victorian legacy, a phenomenon that involves not only culture and politics, but also the economy and the identity of a nation in constant evolution. In the context of a world entering the 20th century, Great Britain found itself at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution had left its indelible mark, society had transformed, and the working class was beginning to demand a place on the political stage. The tensions that had arisen during Victoria's reign, such as the struggles for women's rights and suffrage movements, had not disappeared with the arrival of the new century. Instead, they intensified, fueling a fire that had already begun to burn. What legacy, then, had the Victorian era left in the struggle for equality and civil rights? Key figures such as Emmeline Pankhurst and her suffragist movement stood as emblematic figures, challenging the status quo. Their decisions in a context of resistance and repression would chart the course of the fight for women's voting rights. Meanwhile, the working class, allied with socialists and trade unions, began to organize more forcefully, seeking changes that seemed distant in the days of the Queen. The decisions of these leaders were crucial as they challenged Victorian convictions about the place of women and workers in society. The development of these events witnessed massive demonstrations, strikes, and a growing social awareness. Women who had been relegated to a domestic role began to occupy public spaces, demanding not only the right to vote but also equality in work and education. In 1918, the efforts of the suffragists would culminate in a partial victory, allowing women over the age of 30 to vote in elections. However, this raised a troubling question. Was this truly the end of the struggle or merely the beginning of a new phase? The immediate consequences of these changes were profound. British society, which had been marked by the rigidity of Victorian norms, began to crumble under the weight of new ideas and movements. The clamour of marches and the cries of suffrage for women echoed in the air, while men who had dominated the political space found their positions questioned. The Victorian era, with its emphasis on morality, control and class, transformed into a battleground where new identities were forged and power relations were redefined. However, the Victorian legacy was not limited to political struggles. In the cultural realm, the influence of Victorian literature, art and architecture was strongly felt. Authors such as Charles Dickens and the works of the pre-Raphaelites, for example, not only reflected the realities of their time but also laid the groundwork for later artistic movements. Modernism, which emerged in the 20th century, carried with it influences from the emotional and social complexity that had been captured by Victorian artists. But how much of this legacy had transformed, and how many inheritances from the past persisted in the new narratives? The paradox of this chapter lies in this intersection between the old and the new. As the world moved into modernity, the class, gender and race tensions that had emerged during the Victorian era continued to be present, whispering through the dialogues and struggles that defined the new century. Could British society truly shed the Victorian legacies that followed it, or had this era sown the seeds of conflict and transformation that were still to come? In contemplating the Victorian legacy, we must ask ourselves, what complex aspects still awaited in the depths of this period? To understand the true scope of the heritage it left us, it is essential to follow the thread of history forward toward the next chapter of our narrative, reflections on an era that, although distant, remains alive in contemporary struggles and aspirations. At the twilight of the Victorian era, as the presence of Queen Victoria began to fade, the repercussions of a time filled with contradictions and advancements resonated in every corner of the empire. The legacy of this period, which spanned from 1837 to 1901, intertwines with a tapestry of achievements and failures, of lights and difficulties that have left an indelible mark on the history of Great Britain and the world. As we delve into these final reflections, it is essential to unravel the context that brought this complex era to life. During the last years of the 19th century, Great Britain found itself at a crossroads. As the empire reached its peak, the nation faced internal tensions that questioned the morality of its global influence. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed landscapes and lives, ushered in an era of contradictions where progress and exploitation coexisted in a delicate balance. The growth of industrial cities with their imposing factories and railway tracks contrasted sharply with the misery of the working classes, mired in poverty and helplessness. Was this the price humanity had to pay for advancement? The key players in this historical drama were many, but the figure of Queen Victoria stands out, whose influence extended beyond her role as monarch. Her image became a symbol of the Victorian ideal, a reflection of values such as morality, family, and hard work. However, behind this facade of stability, social movements were developing that questioned the established order. Suffragists and labor rights activists began to raise their voices, challenging the status quo that had prevailed for decades. Could an era marked by oppression and inequality find its redemption through social change? The events that defined the end of the Victorian era are a testament to the complexity of its legacy. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 marked the closing of a chapter, but also the beginning of new challenges. The arrival of the 20th century brought with it a transforming world where ancient structures began to crumble. The empire, which had been a symbol of power and glory, faced questions about its morality and viability. The First World War, which would erupt only a few years later, would be the definitive proof that the age of empires was coming to an end. Leaving in its wake a trail of destruction and disillusionment, was the Victorian era destined to be remembered as a time of fleeting greatness? The immediate consequences of these changes were profound. Victorian society, with its strict rules and norms, began to unravel, giving way to a new era of liberalism and modernity. However, this process was not without its conflicts and contradictions. The movements that emerged during this period, from feminism to socialism, laid the groundwork for a future that, although uncertain, promised greater equity and social justice. But did we truly learn the necessary lessons from an era that had witnessed so much suffering and inequality? The lingering question is what real legacy this complex time left behind. In its quest for progress, Great Britain sowed the seeds of both advancement and suffering. The cities, once emblematic of the Industrial Revolution, became a reflection of class struggles and social tensions. Literature, art and science flourished, but so did colonialism and exploitation. Was the Victorian era a beacon of hope or a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power? As we move away from this time, it is crucial to remember that the influence of Victorian events still resonates today. The struggle for civil rights, the pursuit of gender equality, and the questioning of power structures that began to take shape in this era remain relevant. The legacy of the Victorian age is therefore a mirror in which contemporary society can reflect, contemplating its own challenges and aspirations. In conclusion, the Victorian era, with its rich tapestry of achievements and failures, invites us to reflect on history and its impact on the present. The question that remains is, how will we remember this era in the years to come? As a time of splendor and advancement, or as a dark phase of oppression and inequality? The answer lies in the analysis of our own time and in how we choose to learn from the repercussions of history. If there is anything that the Victorian era has taught us, it is that progress is not a destination, but a journey filled with lessons, and that every step we take toward the future must be guided by the wisdom that comes from our past. In this sense, the legacy of the Victorian era remains alive, as a reminder that the complexity of history is never fully resolved, but rather becomes a constant dialogue between the past and the present.